On a late autumn night, a torrential downpour hammered the quiet outskirts of the city. Sheets of rain cascaded from the heavens like a flood bursting its gates. The faint glow of warm yellow light spilled from the windows of a grand mansion, piercing through the curtain of rain. Outside, the meticulously groomed garden glistened under the downpour. Ornamental shrubs twisted into elegant shapes stood as silent witnesses, their sculpted beauty accentuated by the shimmering water. A towering iron gate, adorned with intricate golden patterns, loomed like a symbol of wealth and power, steadfast against the storm. Inside the opulent villa, Mr. Min, a man in his early 70s, sat alone in a plush armchair. A worn, leather-bound book rested in his hands, its pages marked with age. Since retiring, Mr. Min had lived a solitary life in this sprawling estate, attended only by a handful of servants. His only son, Tuan, had disappeared years ago after a fierce, unresolved argument that left scars on both their hearts. The absence of his son haunted him, and on nights like this, when the rain echoed against the walls, the loneliness felt unbearable. Above the fireplace in the living room hung a large portrait of Tuan. In the painting, Tuan stood tall in a sleek suit, his youthful face glowing with kindness, his sharp eyes full of life. Mr. Min's gaze lingered on the portrait, his heart heavy with regret. Just as he was lost in thought, the shrill chime of the gate bell broke through the sound of rain. The sudden noise startled him, pulling him back to reality. Who could possibly be visiting at this late hour? He furrowed his brows and tapped his wooden cane against the marble floor, signaling a servant to check. The gatekeeper promptly activated the security camera. On the screen appeared the image of a young boy no older than 10. He was soaked to the bone, his ragged clothes clinging to his small frame. His face was smudged with dirt, and his chapped lips trembled from the cold. Through the intercom, the gatekeeper's voice was cold and dismissive. "Who are you? This is private property. You can't take shelter here. Move along." The boy looked up, his wide eyes filled with desperation. "Please, sir," he pleaded, his voice faint yet resolute. "Let me stand under the roof for a while. I don't have anywhere to go, and the rain is too heavy." Hearing the child's fragile plea, Mr. Min's heart stirred. He set his book down, gripped his cane, and rose from his chair. "Let him into the side hall to take shelter," he instructed firmly. "In weather like this, leaving him out there is a death sentence." The staff hesitated for a moment, but did not dare disobey. Slowly, the heavy iron gates creaked open. The boy staggered in, his small body barely holding up against the rain. A servant led him through a stone pathway along the side of the house, careful to avoid the pristine main entrance. Yet, as the boy passed by the large glass windows of the living room, his gaze lingered. Through the glass, the warm light of the room beckoned, and his wide eyes reflected a mixture of wonder and longing. Mr. Min noticed the look on the boy's face and could not turn away. "Bring him in here," he said, his tone softening. The child was ushered into the grand living room. Water dripped from his tattered clothes, leaving dark stains on the polished marble floor. A servant stepped forward to protest, but was silenced by a wave of Mr. Min's hand. "Enough. I'll handle this," he said firmly. Mr. Min studied the boy closely. His thin arms shivered, and his soaked hair clung to his pale forehead. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Why are you wandering the streets in this storm?" The boy lowered his head, his voice barely a whisper. "My name is Hui, my mom. She left to find work. I got lost, and I'm really hungry." The brief words carried a weight of sorrow that struck Mr. Min like a blow. Despite his wealth and power, he realized how detached he had been from the struggles of those less fortunate. Turning to a servant, he ordered, "Bring the boy some hot milk and bread. Quickly." The servant obeyed without hesitation, leaving the room. In the meantime, Hui's curious eyes wandered across the extravagant decor. His gaze stopped on the large portrait of Tuan, which dominated the wall above the fireplace. His expression shifted suddenly. His eyes widened and his lips trembled as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Noticing the change in the boy's demeanor, Mr. Min asked, "What are you looking at?" His voice was softer now, filled with a curious tenderness. Hui hesitated, then slowly stepped toward the portrait. His small, trembling hand pointed at it. That's my dad," he said, his voice quivering. The words hit Mr. Min like a thunderclap. He froze, staring at the boy in disbelief. What did you just say?" he stammered. Hui turned to face him, his eyes shining with a fragile hope. "My mom showed me his picture before. She told me, that's my dad. She said if we had enough money, she would take me to meet my grandpa." Mr. Min's heart pounded in his chest. The boy had just called Tuan his father, which meant this child was his grandson. He looked at Hui, this frail, dirt-streaked boy, and for the first time in years, a spark of something long buried began to stir in his heart. A storm had brought the boy to his doorstep, but perhaps it was more than just the rain that had driven him here. Perhaps it was grace. And as Mr. Min gazed at the boy, he realized that the night, no matter how stormy, might just hold the beginning of a new dawn. The old man sat silently, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his wooden cane. The boy standing before him, a thin, ragged figure with a face smeared with dirt, had just uttered words that struck him like thunder. "Are you sure?" Mr. Min's voice wavered, heavy with both anticipation and doubt. "Hui," the young boy nodded solemnly. "Yes, I'm sure. My mom told me. The man in this picture, he's my father." Mr. Min's heart sank and soared at the same time. This boy, so fragile yet so resolute, might be the only link he had left to his long-lost son. A flood of emotions surged through him, grief, hope, and a deep, aching regret. Outside, the rain poured relentlessly, hammering against the windows, but within the quiet confines of the grand room, time seemed to stop. This fateful meeting between an old man and a boy marked the beginning of a journey neither could have foreseen, a journey filled with revelations and the possibility of redemption. Hai stood in front of a large portrait that hung in the living room. His small, calloused hands gripped his sides as he stared up at the painting. His eyes, glossy with unshed tears, carried a weight far beyond his years. The portrait seemed to stir memories of a mother who had sacrificed everything for him, a mother whose love had sustained him through every hardship. Mr. Min, seated in his armchair, struggled to steady himself. His frail hands gripped the cane tighter, the rhythmic tapping against the floor betraying his inner turmoil. "You said the man in the portrait is your father? Are you absolutely sure?" Mr. Min's voice was hoarse, thick with emotion. Hai nodded again, his gaze unwavering. "My mom said so. She showed me a smaller picture of him once. She said when we had enough money, she'd take me to meet my grandfather." The boy paused, his voice trembling as he continued, "But she never got the chance. She left me before she could bring me here." The boy's words pierced through Mr. Min's heart like a dagger. His chest tightened, memories of the past rushing back like an unstoppable tide. The mention of a son, Tuan, the only child he had ever had, brought both pain and a sliver of hope. Tuan, his pride and joy, a son he had loved more than life itself but had driven away so many years ago. Mr. Min's mind wandered back to the heated arguments, the bitter words exchanged, and the fateful day Tuan had walked out of his life. Tuan had been everything Mr. Min could have hoped for: intelligent, respectful, and ambitious. The perfect heir to the family legacy. But his love for a girl of humble origins had sparked a bitter feud between father and son. Mr. Min, a man of unyielding pride, had refused to accept what he saw as an unsuitable match. The arguments grew more heated until one night Tuan left, vowing never to return. His final words echoed now in Mr. Min's mind. "I'll prove to you that I don't need your money to be happy." At the time, Mr. Min had dismissed it as youthful rebellion. He had been convinced Tuan would come back, humbled and repentant. But the years passed, and Tuan never returned, nor did Mr. Min ever reach out, his pride too great to allow it. Now, decades later, the boy standing before him brought it all rushing back. "Do you remember anything else about your mom or your dad?" Mr. Min asked, his voice softening, as though afraid his questions might break the boy's fragile spirit. He looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom didn't talk about Dad much. She just said he left us a long time ago. But whenever she talked about my grandfather, about you, she said you lived in a big house and were very rich. She told me that if I ever found you, you'd love me and take care of me." The boy's words sliced through Mr. Min's heart. Could it be true? Could the woman he had once deemed unworthy of his son have quietly borne him a grandson? He studied Hui more closely. Despite the boy's worn clothes and thin frame, his eyes shone with a striking brightness, a spark that reminded him painfully of Tuan. This boy wasn't just a stranger, he was all that remained of Tuan, and perhaps he was Mr. Min's one chance to make things right. What was your mother's name?" he asked hesitantly, his voice trembling. Hai looked up, his expression earnest. "Her name was Mai. She said that if I ever met you, I wouldn't have to suffer anymore." The name didn't stir any memories for Mr. Min, yet the sincerity in Hai's eyes made it impossible to doubt the boy's story. His hands, wrinkled and veined, tightened around the cane as he leaned back into his chair. He motioned to a servant standing quietly nearby. "Bring me the family photo albums, the old ones," he ordered. A few moments later, the servant returned with a carefully locked wooden box. Inside were the cherished photos that chronicled Mr. Min's family history, snapshots of a life that now felt so far away. He sifted through the collection, his hands pausing as he pulled out a photograph of Tuan in his youth. The image showed a vibrant, hopeful young man with a smile that now felt like a distant memory. He handed the photograph to Hui. "Look at this. Is this the man your mom showed you?" Hui studied the picture intently, his small hands gripping the edges tightly. Tears welled up in his eyes, and before Mr. Min could say anything more, the boy began to cry. "Yes, that's him. That's my dad. Mom had a smaller picture just like this one. She would look at it whenever she was sad." The boy's quiet sobs filled the room, and for the first time in years, Mr. Min felt tears burning in his own eyes. The truth was undeniable. This boy standing before him was his grandson, and in that moment he realized that Hui was more than just a remnant of his lost son. He was a second chance, an opportunity to right the wrongs of the past. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Mr. Min made a silent vow. No matter what it took, he would protect this boy. He would give Hui the love and care he had failed to give Tuan, and perhaps, through this child, he could finally begin to heal the wounds that had haunted him for so long. The cane trembled in his hand as he slowly stood up, his eyes lowering with a mixture of emotions, regret, pain, and a faint glimmer of happiness, all colliding and leaving his heart in turmoil. "Are you cold, my boy?" he asked softly, his voice trembling. "Go change into something warmer and eat something to warm yourself up." The old man gestured for a servant to take Hui to change, leaving Mr. Min alone in the grand but quiet living room. As the footsteps faded, his gaze turned toward the portrait of Tuan hanging on the wall. His heart grew heavy as he stared into the familiar face of his son. "Tuan," he whispered, almost as though the painting could answer him. "Where are you? Do you even know? My son, Your son has found his way back to me." A surge of determination filled his chest. He clenched his cane tightly. He had to uncover the truth. Was Tuan alive or gone forever? Why had Mai, Tuan's wife, left their son to wander, alone and destitute? 1,000 unanswered questions swirled relentlessly in his mind like an unending storm. That night, as the rain poured heavily against the windows, Mr. Min sat by the large bay window, staring into the darkness outside. The sound of raindrops striking the glass seemed to echo his own guilt and sorrow. He realized then that fate had not brought Hui to his doorstep merely for charity. No, this was his reckoning. Hui was more than just a helpless, lost child seeking refuge. He was flesh and blood, a part of him. Hui was the only remaining link to the son he had lost long ago, and the final opportunity for Mr. Min to atone for the mistakes of his past. Under the dim glow of the table lamp, Mr. Min exhaled deeply. "Tomorrow," he murmured to himself, "I will begin searching for the truth. About Tuan, about Mai, and about everything I turned a blind eye to all those years ago." The next morning, Mr. Min awoke earlier than usual. The rain had cleared, leaving the sky a crisp, brilliant blue, but the clarity outside did nothing to ease the weight pressing on his chest. The memories of the previous night were still vivid, lingering in his mind like an unshakable shadow. At the breakfast table, Hui sat hesitantly, his small hands folded in his lap as he stared at the unfamiliar plates of food before him: toast, eggs, and fruit, things he had never seen, let alone tasted. Mr. Min watched him quietly, noting the boy's unease. "Go ahead, eat," Mr. Min encouraged gently. "Don't be shy. You won't go hungry here anymore." Hui looked up, his eyes uncertain but hopeful. Slowly, he reached for a piece of toast and took a tentative bite. For the first time in his young life, Hui felt the warmth of a family. It was faint, fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind, but it was there. Yet even as he chewed, his brows furrowed with worry. "Where's my mother?" Hui asked suddenly, his voice soft but insistent. The question hit Mr. Min like a dagger. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't answer immediately, lowering his gaze as the weight of the child's question sank in. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise you, Hui, I will find her. Wherever she is, I will find her." After breakfast, Mr. Min summoned a private detective with years of experience. Sitting across the man, Mr. Min handed over an old photograph of Tuan and a larger portrait of Mai, which Hui had identified. "I want you to find this woman," Mr. Min instructed firmly. "Her name is Mai, and she has a son named Hui." The detective studied the photos carefully. "Do you know where she might be living, or anything about her job?" Mr. Min shook his head. "All I know is that she was once my son's wife, but I've never met her. Start your search in the poorer neighborhoods of the city. My son left home years ago. I suspect they lived in very difficult conditions." The detective nodded, promising to begin the investigation immediately. Once he was gone, Mr. Min turned to Hui. "Do you remember anything about where your mother lived, or anything she told you?" Hui thought for a moment before replying. "She once said we lived in a poor neighborhood near a small alley where she sold rice porridge at night, but after she left, I couldn't find my way back." It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. Despite the vague clues, Mr. Min was resolute. He would not give up. By the following evening, the detective returned with new information. "We found a poor neighborhood matching the boy's description," the detective reported. "Mai lived there about a year ago, but moved away." "Why did she leave?" Mr. Min asked, his brow furrowing. The detective hesitated. "She was in debt to a loan shark. Some locals said she was being threatened and had to flee." Hearing this, Mr. Min felt his heart tighten painfully. The thought of a frail woman struggling alone to care for her child while being hounded by violent debt collectors was unbearable. What horrors had Mai endured? Determined to learn more, Mr. Min decided to visit Mai's old neighborhood with Hui. They arrived at a run-down tenement, its walls damp with mildew and the courtyard littered with trash. The air was thick with the smell of decay and poverty. When they asked the landlady about Mai, the woman sighed deeply. Mai, poor thing. She was a sweet girl, but so poor. She worked herself to the bone trying to feed her son, but it was never enough. Those debt collectors came around, yelling, threatening her. She cried all night before she disappeared. She even left without paying the rent. Hui burst into tears as he listened. My mother owed money? Why didn't she tell me? Mr. Min knelt beside Hui, wrapping the boy in a protective embrace. Hey, he said softly, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart. Your mother must have been trying to protect you. Don't blame her. Inside, though, Mr. Min's emotions churned. Guilt, anguish, a fierce determination. He had let his family fall apart, and now it was his responsibility to make things right. Whatever it took, he would find Mai, and he would bring her back. A wave of regret filled Mr. Min's heart. If only he hadn't forbidden Tuan's relationship with Mai, perhaps his daughter-in-law and grandson wouldn't have suffered so terribly now. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the narrow alley. A tattooed man appeared, blocking their path. He sneered, his voice cold and threatening. You're Mai's family, right? The man growled, narrowing his eyes at them. That girl owes me a fortune. Now she's gone into hiding. So tell me, who's gonna pay up? Mr. Min stood his ground, his face pale but calm. I'm Mai's father-in-law, he replied firmly. How much does she owe you? I'll pay. The tattooed man laughed cruelly. Money? You think I care about the money? No, I want her to learn a lesson. But since she's run off... His eyes darted to the boy standing behind Mr. Min. Maybe the kid can take her place? Before anyone could react, the man lunged toward little Hui. Instinctively, Mr. Min stepped in front of his grandson, spreading his arms wide like a shield. Don't you dare touch my grandson, he roared. The tension exploded as the tattooed man grabbed Mr. Min by the arm. One of Mr. Min's assistants, who had accompanied them, rushed to intervene while another frantically dialed the police. Realizing the situation was turning against him, the man released his grip, but not without a chilling threat. I'll find Mai, he hissed, and if I can't, I'll come back for the boy. Mark my words. With that, he stormed off into the shadows. Mr. Min dropped to his knees, pulling Hui close to his chest. The boy was trembling with fear, his small body shivering against his grandfather's protective arms. Don't worry, my dear, Mr. Min whispered softly, his voice breaking. No one will harm you. I won't let them. That terrifying encounter left Mr. Min shaken to his core. It was a stark reminder that time was running out. He knew he had to act fast. Determined, he hired additional bodyguards and increased funding for the private detective already searching for Mai. Days turned into weeks, and just as despair threatened to creep in, a vital lead finally emerged. The detective reported that Mai had once worked as a waitress at a small diner before moving on to a factory job. However, tragedy had struck. The factory had shut down following a severe accident. An elderly security guard at the site vaguely remembered Mai. She was badly injured in the accident, the guard recounted. They took her to a charity hospital, but after that, I don't know what happened to her. Hearing this, Mr. Min's heart sank. Without wasting a moment, he rushed to the charity hospital, clutching a photograph of Mai. An elderly nurse examined the photo carefully, her expression tinged with sorrow. I think I remember her, the nurse said. She passed away last year. There was a woman who looked very much like this in the photo. She came in badly injured with no family by her side, She succumbed to an infection after just a few days. Her words struck Mr. Min like a bolt of lightning. "My daughter-in-law is dead," he stammered, his voice trembling. The nurse nodded solemnly. Before she died, she kept calling out for her son. She left behind a note, just a single piece of paper, with the name Hui written on it. She said she regretted not being able to bring her child to meet her husband's family. Mr. Min's legs gave way, and he sank to the floor. Tears streamed down his face as the weight of her words crushed him. He had not only lost his son, but now he had lost the daughter-in-law he had never even had the chance to meet. All that remained was his grandson, his only connection to the family he had once had. Hui stood silently beside his grandfather, his young face filled with confusion and fear. Back at the mansion, Mr. Min broke the devastating news to Hui. "Your mother," he began, his voice trembling, "has passed away." Hui's small frame crumpled as he burst into tears. "No, that's not true. She promised him. She promised she'd come back for me," he cried, his voice filled with heartbreak. Mr. Min wrapped his arms tightly around the boy, his own tears falling freely. "I'm sorry, Hui," he whispered. "I failed. I couldn't save your mother, but I promise you from now on I will protect you. You're all I have left." In the vast, lonely mansion, two grieving souls clung to each other for comfort. The pain of their loss was immeasurable, but in each other, they found a reason to keep moving forward. The search for Mai had ended in sorrow, but it also opened the door to a new bond between grandfather and grandson, a bond forged in love and resilience. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the mansion grew quieter, heavier. Mr. Min spent most of his time with Hui, doing everything he could to ease the boy's pain. Slowly, despite the lingering sadness, Hui began to find solace in his grandfather, the only family he had left. One morning, Mr. Min took Hui to the garden behind the mansion. The soft sunlight bathed the space, and the white flowers were in full bloom, their petals glowing gently in the light. Mr. Min pointed to a weathered stone bench beneath a tree. "Your father and I used to sit there," he said softly. "Your dad loved these white flowers. Whenever he was sad, I'd bring him here and we'd talk." Hui listened quietly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Mom loved white flowers too," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Min smiled faintly and bent down to pick up a fallen blossom from the ground. "Did you know," he said, his voice warm, "you're so much like your father? Your eyes, the way you look at the world." Hui blinked up at his grandfather, his small hands clutching the flower he had picked moments before. In that moment, amidst their shared grief, a fragile but undeniable sense of hope began to bloom. Together, they would navigate the darkness, carrying forward the love and memories of those they had lost. And in that bond, they found the strength to keep going. Hui gazed at everything around him, but his eyes kept returning to his grandfather. In that moment, he saw something familiar, a reflection of his own image. His quiet words carried a weight of emotion as he softly said, "Grandpa, my mom used to tell me that you're a very kind man. She said that if you ever met me, you'd love me." Hui's words struck deep. Mr. Min's throat tightened with emotion. "I was wrong, Hui," he finally admitted, his voice trembling. "I thought I was doing the right thing back then, being strict, refusing to accept your parents. But the truth is, I made a terrible mistake. That mistake, it broke our family apart." Hui reached out and gently held his grandfather's hand. "Grandpa," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "you're all I have left now. I don't want you to feel sad anymore. I'll be good. I'll study hard so I can make you happy." Those words filled Mr. Min with a mixture of regret and resolve. He pulled Hui into a tight embrace, his heart heavy with the weight of the past, but also brimming with hope for the future. In that moment, they both realized something important. No matter how painful the past had been, they still had a chance to rebuild a brighter future together. A week later, Mr. Min made a significant decision. He enrolled Hui in a prestigious private school, determined to give the boy the best possible education. On Hui's first day at the new school, he stood at the gate dressed in his crisp new uniform. He looked up at the grand building with wide, hesitant eyes, glancing nervously at the other children his age running and laughing together. Sensing his grandson's anxiety, Mr. Min placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry, Hui," he said gently. "You'll make friends soon. You're smart and kind. I believe in you." Hui nodded, a small but determined smile appearing on his face. Although he was nervous, his grandfather's warm encouragement gave him the strength to take his first steps into the classroom. As Hui disappeared into the building, Mr. Min stood at a distance, watching. His eyes lingered on the boy, once so frail and timid, now standing tall in his neatly pressed uniform. In that moment, Mr. Min felt a surge of pride mixed with lingering regret. Pride that his grandson was beginning to forge a bright future. Regret that he had failed to provide the same care and understanding for Hui's parents, Tuan and Mai. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Mr. Min instructed the chef to prepare a simple meal. Instead of the lavish feasts that once adorned their table, there was only a steaming bowl of soup and a few familiar dishes, comfort foods that Hui's mother used to make. Hui stared at the table in surprise, his eyes brimming with recognition. These were the same meals his mother used to cook when she was alive. "I thought you might not be used to the fancy dishes we've been having," Mr. Min explained. "From now on, we'll eat like this instead." Hui lowered his head, murmuring a quiet, "Thank you," but tears streamed down his cheeks as he thought of his mother. "Mom used to make just one packet of noodles last for the both of us," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She always made sure I had the bigger portion. I wish she could see me now. I wish she could see that I'm finally eating enough." Mr. Min reached out and clasped his grandson's hand tightly. "I'm so sorry, Hui. I let your mother suffer, but I promise, from now on, I'll make up for it. You're my only family now." From that day forward, their meals became a time of connection rather than extravagance. No longer grand and impersonal, they were filled with simple dishes and warm conversations. Slowly, the once cold atmosphere of the mansion began to change. The grand halls that had felt so empty now echoed with laughter and quiet chatter. It was as if the house had found its long-lost soul. But even as their lives started to settle into this new, quieter rhythm, a shadow still loomed over them. The threat from the tattooed man had not entirely disappeared. Refusing to let the matter rest, Mr. Min filed a formal complaint with the police. He worked with a lawyer and a private investigator to gather evidence against the man. It didn't take long before the authorities acted. The tattooed man was arrested for his threats and involvement in illegal activities. Standing at the gates of the mansion, Mr. Min watched as the police car drove away, carrying the man who had once endangered his grandson's life. A sense of relief washed over him, knowing that the danger was finally behind them. One quiet afternoon, Hui sat in the living room, gazing at the family photos hanging on the wall. His eyes lingered on one particular picture, and he pointed to it, asking, "Grandpa, is this my mom? Was she happy when she lived here with you?" Mr. Min's eyes softened as he looked at the photograph. It was of his daughter Mai, smiling brightly, holding a bouquet of flowers in the garden. "Yes, Hui," he said after a pause, his voice tinged with both fondness and sorrow. "Your mom was a wonderful person, kind, hardworking, and so full of life. I loved her very much." In that moment, as Mr. Min reminisced about the past, he realized something. Though he couldn't change what had happened, He still had the chance to honor his daughter's memory by giving Hui the life she had always dreamed of for him. Together, they would face the future with hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. The decision to reject his son-in-law had torn his family apart. Min sat silently beside Hui, feeling the weight of deep regret in his heart. Hui, sensing his grandfather's pain, looked up at him and said softly, "Grandpa, I don't think Mom would be upset with you. She always said you were a good man and that everything you did was because you wanted the best for Dad." Hui's gentle words brought a wave of calm over Min. His grandson's innocence and understanding seemed to soothe the storm in his soul. In that moment, Min resolved to never repeat the mistakes of the past. Early the next morning, he and Hui prepared a small altar in the mansion's prayer room. On the altar, Min placed a large photograph of Mai, his late daughter, next to a bouquet of white flowers that Hui had chosen. As Hui knelt before the altar, lighting a stick of incense for his mother, he whispered, "Mom, I promise I'll study hard and be good. I won't make you worry. I'll do my best to live a good life with Grandpa." Min stood silently beside him, tears streaming down his cheeks. Looking at Mai's photo, he murmured, "Mai, I'm so sorry. I promise I'll love and take care of Hui the way you would have wanted. Please rest in peace now." From that day forward, Min took steps to give Hui the life he deserved. He hired private tutors to help Hui catch up in school. Over time, the once frail and timid boy began to thrive. Hui grew stronger, more confident, and started adapting well to his new environment. His eyes, which once held shadows of sadness, began to shine with hope for a brighter future. One evening, as the golden glow of the sunset bathed the garden, Hui rested his head on Min's shoulder. For the first time in years, the boy felt a sense of safety he had almost forgotten. He closed his eyes and said softly, "Grandpa, I love you so much. I think Mom would be happy seeing us together." Min gently stroked his grandson's hair, his gaze drifting to the garden bathed in warm light. His heart was full of emotion, a mix of gratitude for this second chance and regret for the loved ones he had lost. In the weeks that followed, Min restructured his life to create the best environment for Hui. The boy quickly adjusted to their new routine, attending school during the day and working with his tutors at home in the evenings. One morning, as Min was preparing to take Hui to school, he noticed the boy standing by the door holding a small bouquet of white flowers. Hui looked up at him and said, "Grandpa, I want to take these flowers to Mom's altar. I want to pray that she keeps watching over me." Min nodded and led Hui upstairs to the prayer room. Together, they stood before Mai's photograph. The flickering candlelight illuminated their tear-streaked faces as they offered their prayers. Min whispered, "Mai, I promise I'll take care of Hui with all my heart. Please rest easy." Hui knelt beside him, clasping his hands in prayer. "Mom," he said softly, "I'll be good and do my best to make you proud. I'll stay by Grandpa's side so he won't feel lonely anymore." That moment became a cornerstone in the healing journey of both grandfather and grandson. Though Mai was gone, her love remained a guiding light in their lives, illuminating their path forward. One afternoon, while cleaning his study, Min discovered an old wooden box tucked away in a corner. Inside, he found a collection of family keepsakes, including an old photograph of his son Tuan as a young boy playing in the backyard. Min called Hui over to see it. "Look, Hui, this is your father when he was about your age," Min said, handing him the photo. "He was such an energetic boy, always running around and playing in the garden. When I look at you, I see so much of him in you." Hui studied the photograph intently. "Grandpa," he asked, "do you think I look like Dad?" Min smiled warmly. "Yes, you do. You've got his bright eyes and his optimistic spirit. It's like a part of him lives on in you." This connection to his father gave Hui a deeper sense of belonging. For the first time, he didn't feel so alone. He realized that he was part of a family, one that had loved deeply and still cared for him. Min began introducing Hui to family traditions they used to share, planting flowers in the garden, preparing meals together on weekends, and cherishing simple, joyful moments. One sunny afternoon, as they planted a white rose bush in the garden, Hui paused and asked, "Grandpa, did Mom like white roses?" Min's face softened. Yes, she loved them. Whenever the roses bloomed, she would sit here for hours, just admiring their beauty. She once told me that white roses reminded her of hope and peace. Hui smiled as he placed the last rose bush into the soil. "Then I'll take care of these roses for Mom," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in hues of gold and pink, Min and Hui sat together on the porch. For the first time in a long while, the weight of grief felt lighter. The love they shared and the memories of Mai had become a source of strength for both of them. Their journey of healing was far from over, but together they had found a way forward, rooted in love, guided by hope, and inspired by the memory of the one they had lost. Of purity and unconditional love, Hui smiled softly as he gently placed his hand on the newly planted white roses. "From now on, every time I see a white rose, I'll remember my mom," he said quietly. "I'll imagine her smiling from above, watching over you and me, happy that we are living a good life." Hui's words stirred something deep within Mr. Min. He realized that even though Mai, his daughter, was no longer with them, she was still the bond that connected him and Hui. She had become the reason for both of them to keep moving forward toward a brighter future. Yet, as life gradually returned to normal, Mr. Min couldn't stop worrying about Hui's future. One day, he called Hui into his study, gesturing for the boy to sit down. With a warm but serious expression, Mr. Min said, "Hui, I want you to know that no matter what happens, I'll always be here to protect you. But at the same time, I want you to grow strong and independent so that one day you can stand firmly on your own 2 feet." Hui looked up at his grandfather, his eyes filled with determination. "Grandpa," he replied, "I promise I'll do my best. I won't let you down. I want you to always feel proud of me." Mr. Min smiled and nodded. "I'm already proud of you, Hui. You've shown me what family truly means, and I know you'll accomplish great things in the future." Time passed, and Hui became an exceptional student, consistently achieving top marks in his class. He was well loved by both his friends and teachers. Each time Mr. Min saw the boy shining brightly, his heart filled with warmth and pride. One evening, as Hui sat at his desk studying, Mr. Min quietly observed him from the doorway. The once frail and timid boy had grown into a strong and determined young man. As he watched, Mr. Min thought to himself, "My Tuan, you can rest easy now. Hui is growing up so well, and I'll do everything I can to ensure he has a bright future." Their story, though marked by loss and heartache, was also one of healing and hope. 2 lonely souls, Mr. Min and Hui, had found each other, becoming each other's support and inspiration as they faced the road ahead. The light of familial love had guided them through the darkness of the past, and now led them toward happier days. In the early days of living at the mansion, Hui often woke up crying in the middle of the night, missing his mother. But thanks to Mr. Min's tender care and affection, he gradually overcame the pain of loss. He was no longer the shy, fragile boy who had first stepped into the large and lonely house. With the help of his tutor and his own relentless efforts, Hui quickly caught up with his classmates. He became more outgoing, often sharing funny stories from school with his grandfather. One evening, as they sat together in the reading room, Hui hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Grandpa, I want to study hard so that I can become a doctor one day. I want to help poor people just like my mom always tried to do." Mr. Min nodded, his eyes glistening with pride. "Hey, follow your dreams. I'll always support you. You are the future of our family. On the first anniversary of Mai's passing, Mr. Min and Hui held a small memorial in the family's prayer room. Mai's photograph was carefully placed on the altar beside a bouquet of white roses that Hui had arranged himself. Lighting an incense stick, Hui knelt before his mother's portrait and whispered, "Mom, I miss you."